InRangeTV's Karl Kasarda on why he thinks gun rights advocates should be more concerned about Trump's DC takeover. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. No, the devil's got no hold on me. All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses on hard news and analysis. This week, we are talking about the deployment of federal agencies or agents and National Guard troops to Washington, D.C., and whether or not gun rights advocates should be concerned about this. And to do that, we have with us a well-known GunTuber, Karl Kasarda from InRangeTV. Welcome to the show. This is the first time on the interview podcast. You've been on our news update podcast. But we appreciate you coming over and sharing your perspective with us here on the main podcast.
Yeah, Stephen, thanks for having me on here. And obviously, it would be nice to be able to talk about something that's a less concerning topic, but these are the things that are in our world right now. So it's what's relevant at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And just give people a little bit about your background before we get going here.
Yeah. I run InRangeTV, which is both a media project and community building project. We have events and competitions that we run across the country for people. But I think what's distinctive about our work is that it's a very legitimately inclusive space that I've described as where firearms, culture, history, and human rights all come together in one space. So we talk about it from what seems to be a fairly unique perspective we don't see a lot in the GunTube space in terms of like the history of firearms and firearms rights and the good and bad things, both that have been done with those objects in our society.
And I think you have a fairly unique view in the gun world as well, and you're more willing to be critical of this administration and President Donald Trump here. And so I wanted to get your view on this because I think you have spoken out more on these sorts of concerns around, using federal law enforcement in the way that the Trump administration is doing right now in D.C., as well as federal troops. And these raise concerns about civil liberties, and it's something that I don't think you see a lot of discussion about in the gun world yet, because it hasn't touched maybe directly on guns very often. We're mostly focused more on immigration right now. But we did have a news this week that the Reload broke that ATF agents are part of this federal flood of resources into the district. We were told that there are about 30 agents involved in this operation, and we've seen some interesting videos already coming out that show ATF agents in them, and we'll get into some of that in a little bit. But I don't know, is this something that raises concerns for you, the way that this is going on? Obviously, the claim here is that DC has a crime problem. This was initiated by an assault on a former Doge staffer by a group of teenagers. And the president essentially said that, the president has said quite a lot. He's quite hyperbolic, as everyone is well aware at this point. But essentially, he claimed that the place is out of control and he needs to send in federal law enforcement officers to clean up the city, take over control of the local police department, and even send in National Guard troops to do some work. We'll get into maybe a little bit more on that later, but I don't know. That's his justification. He thinks it's he's claiming it's going to be a crime deterrent to have these agents in there. You think this is a problem, though?
Well, I wouldn't have any doubt that it's a crime deterrent, but I would also argue that it's a freedom deterrent. The reality of a regular citizen to feel safe and free in their society they live in is one, yes, of course, to not be affected by crime. And I am not a DC resident, but I can only speak to the information I've seen in terms of the data that's been represented and that the crime is actually on decline. In fact, it's at one of an all-time lows, as well as interviews that I've seen online and on regular media of residents that have said that they're not really that concerned about crime in their hometown. So that's interesting to see that the people that live there don't seem to share this concern. But that's not to say that there isn't crime. I'm not saying that at all. But the hyperbolic is one term you use, but the extensive use of not only one, but multiple agencies frequently hiding their own identities, as we've seen not only with ICE, but now as well with this, as agents and public agents of the state that are supposed to serve the people, hiding themselves. That's a curiosity in and of itself. I don't know about you, but myself, and I'm sure others that I've seen as well, when their home is suddenly essentially a militarily occupied place, that is another feeling of not being safe. Seeing men walking around with in full gear, maybe like questioning you just for walking down the street, which I have seen reports of, is not something that, and to me at least, inspires a sense of freedom or safety. It's another form of concern and frankly, in my opinion, intentional fear mongering.
And just to get at the ATF part of this real quick, is because I mean, it's not the first time we've seen something like this happen in President Trump's second term, right? We saw the National Guard and the Marines sent to Los Angeles during backlash to ICE raids that occurred out there, which did feature some rioting, right? I think it's fair to call. It might have, maybe it's not on the level of rioting as some other past riots we've had, but I give the argument in that case, I guess, is you send in the additional forces to prevent it from getting worse or what have you. But obviously there was a lot of discussion around these sort of civil liberty concerns and safety concerns during that deployment as well. But what's different about this one, to me at least, what I see as a notable difference perhaps for the gun community, is the use of ATF agents. ATF agents have been involved with immigration enforcement. I mean, really, you get a lot of joint task force and federal law enforcement. It's not uncommon to see ATF agents working with ICE agents or DEA agents or whatever. I do think that that's been ramped up significantly on the side of immigration during this administration, certainly. But now we have what's maybe a more general use of the ATF to do sort of street policing. There was a video that came out, I think it was filmed Monday night when this was all first happening, that showed a group of federal agents walking around just a DC neighborhood and interacting with some residents sitting on their stairs outside their house. There's park police doing most of the talking in that incident. But and to be fair, the incident doesn't go anywhere. No arrests are made, and there wasn't any sort of even verbal argument, really. But the park police officer says, they're just kind of doing quality of life policing, saying they approached them because they smelled marijuana and thought maybe somebody was smoking a marijuana joint, but it turned out the guy was just smoking a cigarette, and so they kind of moved on from there. But part of that group was an ATF agent, and this is, while it didn't result in anything in this incident, it is them kind of going door to door doing policing, which has been a sensitivity for a lot of agents. Is that maybe something about this incident, this event in DC, which we're in the very early stages of, obviously, that raises additional concerns for you, or have you been concerned about all this since the LA situation?
I've been concerned since the beginning of this for sure, and I think this is just frankly another escalation of that. So, what we saw in LA and such, yes, there was definitely unrest there for sure. At the same time, I don't think it's fair to say that the unrest was entirely inspired only by the civilians. There is a lot of video evidence of the extensive amount of deployment of these forces actually escalating the violence in the protests in LA. So in fact, there's a lot of evidence of that, video of that, of just even media standing reporting about the police are over there, we're over here, and then suddenly they get shot at with less lethal devices just for standing there and reporting. So
an incident with an LAPD officer.
Yeah, that's fact. That's not conjecture. I'm not going to say that it didn't go both directions. I'm sure it did, but there are multiple instances of video evidence of the state and police actually instigating the riot in some instances, at least. So, on top of that, while masking their identities, while supposedly not allowing others to do so, is a level of hypocrisy. Above and beyond, it is interesting that what happened in LA, but now what we see in DC. And DC is a legally strange space in terms of how law enforcement works. So that's worth mentioning at some point in this conversation. But there is a level of hypocrisy that is so hard to evade that I don't understand how others in the firearms community aren't pointing it out, besides the fact that they're either A, are aligned with these, what I believe to be authoritarian movements, or they only care if it's guns. And that's why this ATF element is interesting to discuss. But when we talk about the level of crime that might be existing in these spaces, whether it was in LA with the ICE raids or what we're seeing now in DC, I would like to remind the audience that on January 6th, police officers were killed. And the reaction was not this. And so you want to talk about violence and insurrection. That was a day in which that was absolutely the case in DC. And we did not see this response for that. But now that we see the second term, we have multi-agency agents walking around doing quote unquote quality of life enforcement. I don't know about you all, but going to go get my groceries and being asked for my papers, please, is not quality of life to me.
There have been roadblocks. In fact, I'm actually going into DC later today to watch the Phillies game, hopefully. But that is one of the things that a little bit concerned about running into one of these roadblocks, not necessarily for my safety, but just they have been springing up around the city as part of, I guess, an immigration for. They just it's a little unclear what the roadblocks are for, but they have happened in a couple places. Although I do want to, I guess, to get at this, you label this authoritarian, right? And I do want to try and keep like a focus on the situation at hand, right? What's
Sure.
actually, like I said, I'm going into DC. I live near DC. Live in Alexandria, just across the river. I'm not afraid to go in there right now. I'm not necessarily. Shouldn't have any reason to be. I haven't broken any laws or done anything bad. But and I guess I'm just trying to say, like, it's not as though the city has turned into 1930s Berlin overnight here, and I guess this is what. Getting back to just the label that you put on authoritarian, what is it? It seems to me that a lot of what's happened so far, especially the deployment of these aggressive tactics, whether from federal law enforcement or even using the National Guard troops, does begin to push up against some legal limits. Right? There's in LA, there's an ongoing lawsuit about whether or not the National Guard, which can be deployed, right? It's been deployed in the past, usually to break up rioting, is when we've seen it almost exclusively for that purpose, right? But it can be deployed, and but it's not supposed to do certain things. There's federal laws that govern this, right? The Posse Comitatus, I can never pronounce it properly.
Comitatus, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Posse Comitatus Act prevents the military from being used for domestic law enforcement purposes outside of certain exceptions, like situations with rioting, and usually only at the request of the governor or governing body of the state that is asking for federal assistance. And so in LA, there's claims that they went past these lines, that they did do some forms of law enforcement. They were allowed to detain people in order to then hand them over to law enforcement. They went on sort of raids with ICE and the DEA to provide security, I guess was the reasosoning there. But, there's legal challenges over whether or not they crossed the line there. But it wasn't like, they didn't march in and start rounding up, every American citizen who votes Democrat or anything like that. Same thing here in DC, where we've seen, again, as you mentioned, DC is legally a unique place where it's a federal enclave, but it has home rule. There's a federal act for that, the Home Rule Act, that governs what the president can and can't do. And it allows him to use, in emergencies, power to at least direct the local police department, the Metropolitan Police Department, on what to do. It can't necessarily, there's limits to that as well. And the same thing here, like the deployment of this 800 National Guard, the Army says they're just going to do logistical support. They're not going to be doing law enforcement directly. As I mentioned, the situation in California calls that into question, but it's not necessarily to the situation where it's just overtly blowing past all limits. They seem more like they're testing the limits. I don't know. Is that fair to say, or do you disagree and think it's
I
more
actually do
like
think
they blow?
that's fair to say. So I think that when you just mentioned like the differences, and we're touching on how DC is a unique space legally speaking, right? So I think the questions about what happened in California are more intense and interesting from the perspective is that, as I understand it, the governor of the state did not ask for the National Guard to be deployed, and they definitely did not ask for the Marines to be deployed, which is different because that was done as well. It wasn't just National Guard; it was the Marines, which is above and beyond National Guard. And then the reports of them being there is that they were generally bored and questioning what their mission was. But that's a whole other topic.
Right. Which does feel like how it might turn out in DC. Well, a lot of this feels like it's also just for show, to be honest.
It might very well, but like DC is different, and like you said, the home rule and all of the things that make DC a strange space legally speaking. This may very well be far more or even entirely legal compared to what happened in California. So I wouldn't argue that, but I would argue that I said earlier, like I don't personally define quality of life of being questioned for doing basic living things like going to get my groceries, which is at this point not impossible. If they're questioning people on the street for smelling a cigarette, of which one of the agents was an ATF agent, that's a strange thing to have to do by just living your normal, natural life. And I don't consider that. That does not make me personally feel safe. That makes me feel threatened. Now, others might feel otherwise, but I know that I'm not alone in those feelings. In terms of what they're doing right now, yeah, when I use the word authoritarian, I'm not trying to say that it's quite there yet. At the same time, though, in my opinion, these are authoritarian tactics that are being used to test the waters for the perspective of what people will tolerate and accept. And I think a lot of this is that's what, in my opinion, a lot of what's going on is this is how far can we push this until we get blowback that is unsustainable. And as it stands right now, from a lot of the core support base of which the firearms community seems to be an extensively aligned with Trump and this administration for whatever reason, they do not seem to be pushing back, or at least not speaking out. Now, some are, some aren't. But when it comes to the gun community, I don't see that. I mostly see people either being quiet or cheering it on, which I find very strange, considering the kind of messaging that the firearms community has had historically. And when we go back to like the 90s, or frankly, we think about the raids that were happening post Hurricane Katrina, which the anniversary is coming up right now, in which they were going door to door. And even I remember there was footage of them breaking some old woman's arm because she had a revolver. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I'm not saying that's what's happening now, but that sort of behavior that we're seeing now behooves that becoming common and more people just expect. And I don't think in America we expect to be questioned about what we're doing every moment of our lives by an agent of the state, whether it's ATF or someone else. Like I said, just living our normal daily lives. That to me is not natural, not normal. And yes, to me, that is authoritarian.
Okay. And so, because I guess one way to look at it is in terms of, why don't you hear more from the gun rights group? So first off, I guess you should note that you have seen some pushback from, I think, the National Association for Gun Rights. I think Hannah Hill is one of their lawyers, talking about not wanting to trade liberty for security. You've seen some specific pushback in this DC deployment around arrests of residents for carrying a gun without a permit when that was the only charge. You've seen the White House has bragged about that and gotten some pushback from Republican Congressman Thomas Massey. And then I think Firearms Policy Coalition was cheering that on. I think Gun Owners of America has also criticized those kinds of arrests. Excuse me. But yeah, certainly I would agree that there's not a broad-based pushback against either the deployment of the National Guard or the police takeover here, or even of some of these more aggressive ATF tactics, having them patrol neighborhoods or doing masking in one case in Minneapolis. I will say that the ATF has not embraced the masking nearly as much as other agencies, and they did claim after that incident in Minneapolis that it was just a one-off thing because of chemical irritants that have been used for crowd control.
Well, I remember that.
Whether you believe the ATF on that is another question, but we haven't seen a lot of ATF agents masking after that, so I feel they were being genuine. But at the same time, there's been some pushback, not a lot. And I wonder your perspective on this administration as it pertains to gun policy, because you're talking about some of the policing tactics that they've used, and what your concerns are with them, and why you think they should bother more gun rights activists. But probably one of the reasons you're not seeing a lot of push or as much pushback as you might expect, especially under like a Democratic administration, right, would be that this administration has done a number of things that gun rights activists like, right? They've rolled back a lot of the ATF rules from the Biden administration, including the zero tolerance policy for gun dealers, the pistol brace rule. They stopped defending that in court, although they haven't gone to the lengths of actually trying to repeal the rule yet. There have been a number of investigations that DOJ has launched into delayed concealed carry permitting processes in places like Los Angeles. In fact, we just got news today that in DC itself, while they're making these arrests for carrying without a permit, they are also simultaneously forcing the Metropolitan Police Department to streamline their permitting process, which is one that includes the kind of months-long delays that we've seen in places like LA and other highly restrictive areas. So, I guess, do you give the administration any credit for some of these pro-gun things they're doing? And why don't you think that that maybe outweighs some of the concerns you would have on the policing side?
Well, I mean, I would advocate for many of those changes anyway, from the perspective as an activist and a person that believes in this as a basic human and civil right. So personally, I know that it may not always resonate with everyone in the audience, but I think a permit process for your basic civil right of self-defense is inappropriate, and I'm a proponent of constitutional carry, because permit, while I really do wish that we had a community that was more willing to train and be well regulated, as the Constitution says, in terms of being skilled at arms with something they're going to carry. The problem with permit processes is that they are generally, and as you're saying right now, like delays, for example, heavily abused, either by a bureaucrat that doesn't believe in that particular right, or for worse and more nefarious reasons, like you're a part of a marginalized community. Not that different than like literacy tests for voting during Jim Crow. If you're the wrong person, they'll find a way to make sure your rights denied through a permit process. So in terms of enhancing firearms rights and clearing the way for 2A causes, I think that they have done some things in that regard. However, I'm not going to forget that this is the same president in his first term that banned bump stocks via fiat. I think that what we're seeing, in my opinion, is political posturing on their part, and shrewdly so, to cater to a core base of their supporters. Because a lot of firearms guys and firearms community, I don't mean guys even gendered, I mean firearms community as a whole, seems to equate guns and more availability of guns as the and only one civil right that makes the difference. And I'm not saying that everyone feels that way, but it is very common in that space where if it's pro gun, it's good. And if it's not, it's bad. And everything else seems to be kind of left on the side. I don't even know if intentionally as much as myopically, like they're so focused on one thing that the rest gets left out of the conversation. And for me, as a person that hopefully has done a lot of historical work and research and trying to understand the broader scope over the long haul of American history, these other violations or concerns about this kind of policing, or the masking of ICE, or people being sent to foreign prisons or places like Alligator Alcatraz, while they are not gun related directly, if the general arc of history would indicate that that type of behavior is building up to something worse. I hope it's not, but it sure seems like it. And while firearms are one of our basic human civil rights, so is not being deported to El Salvador. So, and I don't know that basic firearm civil rights, even if they're enhanced, would fix that, because what stops that sort of thing, if it does get out of control, I would argue it already is, but I'm going to say if, because some people wouldn't agree. If it gets out of control, it's the mass of human, the mass of the civilian populace not accepting it, protest and civil disobedience that usually is the actual thing that stops this type of thing if it gets out of control. And firearms are more really community defense and localized, not generally something that stops this across holistically across the board. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't see firearms rights, while I do believe in them and believe they should be bolstered. And I will say, yes, they have done some of that. I do not see it as a magic totem to prevent the rise of authoritarianism, if that is what is happening, which I personally believe is.
So for you, because yeah, I mean, if we engage with that idea, right? So some people think, it's very difficult for a tyrant to oppress people if they're armed, right? And so if someone is not going after the guns, then they must not be a tyrant.
Except the right, but I think it is interesting. It is interesting to note that when we look at the groups that are being targeted right now, um, they are people that have most likely been legally or for legal reasons not allowed to, or even disenfranchised from firearms rights. With the ICE raids, I'm sure that they are finding undocumented people. I'm sure that's the case, but they are throwing that net out in a way that is so broad and with seemingly little discretion that it's hitting essentially a community of people of color, is the way I would put it. And that is a group that typically, especially if they're undocumented, legally speaking, have been disenfranchised from rights to firearms. Um, and that's a contentious topic, because people have said, do you need to be a legal citizen to own a gun? Right? That's one of those things. I personally think myself, the Bill of Rights applies to humans, but that's not a universal view. But it does mean that the group that they're coming after probably isn't generally armed the way you would think of as like general gun guy. Now, if this is testing the water for how far they can push law enforcement and legal aggregation, and including now ATF, which it's hard pressed to find gun people that are fans of the ATF, let's be honest. Because of the history that the countries have with that agency. If
Oh,
this
and
is
Ruby
testing
Ridge,
the
I guess.
waters, I think that when one of these topics is done with, such as that of undocumented immigration, there will be other things to pursue, which are dissidents, political adversaries, people that are they'll use the term terrorists, in my opinion, but it'll just be people that are not aligned with their views. And this thing that's being built now, this monster, will be weaponized against American citizens too in the long run. And I don't think guns make that difference.
Well, that is something that's a pretty dark picture, certainly, that you've painted there. And there are a lot of other, of course, bulwarks against those sorts of abuses, right? As we still live in a functioning society at this point, where the court system is open and taking these disputes, including disputes around the use of force by the president, the deployment of troops. This takeover of the police department is now being challenged. At least, we mentioned there the president seems to have a significant amount of authority to do some emergency action, but maybe not everything that they've tried to do to this point, because the administration is trying to not just direct MPD on how to use its resources, but also it's trying to institute new policies that would ignore DC laws. Like the DC has a sanctuary law, essentially, that bars certain kinds of cooperation between local police and ICE, and the president is trying to overdo that. But now they're fighting in court over this question, and at least to this point, I think, again, this is an area where maybe we've seen some pushing up to the lines or trying to push boundaries, but not full-on ignoring of court orders. There have been some situations where that's been alleged at one point or another, but not on a wide-scale basis. And so, this is something that I think you've talked about in your work before, is like, not trying to go straight to the most radical solution to these problems. You're not going to like political violence, which is the implicated final step in defending your rights against tyranny would be armed resistance. I would imagine you don't think we're anywhere near that point today, right? Just trying to get
I don't want us to ever get to that point. The idea that you need to be armed to go get your groceries is a terrifying world that I don't think anyone should ever want to live in. It's a failing of so many things to get to that point where, I mean, violence as a whole is a failing of humanity in general. If there are so many steps that have to be missed before violence occurs, even for the most basic version of it, such as a guy mugging you on the street because he's addicted to drugs or just out or having a terrible life. I mean, there's lots of reasons that these things happen. Missing social nets, for example, in my opinion, that could do better. Things that we could change in our society that would be more empathetic versus prosecutorial, persecuting people might make a difference too. It might not remove all of that. I'm sure there's always going to be something or someone, but things that we could do that are more empathetic in this society would be, in my opinion, a stretch towards avoiding violence. And anyways, where I'm going with this is violence should be the thing that we all try to avoid to the most utmost possible stretch of our imagination. And that's what concerns me, though, is that I don't necessarily see that always being the case in the other direction. Like I mentioned earlier, watching, at least in some instances, law enforcement instigating the violence during in LA. That I don't know what you do with that, and that needs to be. And it seems like not much comes of that. So there are definitely instances of seeing that happen in LA, and hopefully we won't see this in DC. But like, there doesn't seem to be any repercussions for that, and that's what concerns me. Is that if a civilian does that, yes, they should be prosecuted and should be in jail. Although that's not what happened with Jan 6; they got paroled. However, if an agent of the state does that, the same thing should happen to them. Like that should not be an acceptable thing. Violence is only the last possible options, and it should be only in self-defense, and that includes both directions, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a level of credibility issue for the administration when they talk about being concerned about assaults on police officers after pardoning a bunch of people who assaulted police officers on January 6th. But I think it is important to understand that this not and honestly, this could be a larger conversation. And I believe you had a very good video with Atun Shea Films where you discussed John Brown and the impetus for violence and this the core concept of a lot of people hold about the Second Amendment being a bulwark against tyranny through the threat of essentially armed revolution. Mm-hmm. And that gets thrown around pretty easily in Second Amendment circles. I think often it's just this concept of like,
I would say, well, we could always actually it gets thrown around recklessly. Yeah.
And so I wanted to. I'm sure that I know that you would not be doing that lightly here, and that that's where I want to get back to. Like, obviously, while it sounds to me, just to sum up, what you've said here, that like you're concerned about these tactics. You think that they are authoritarian in nature, even if we aren't not yet at an authoritarian government, because the safeguards from the Constitution and the structure of our government still exist and are still working, at least for now, right? But but you're concerned about where this is headed.
Yeah, I'm concerned that they're testing to find out if they can break those protections, frankly. I mean, so like when we saw the deportation of a few individuals to El Salvador, there was a moment there where there was a lot of pressure legally from many judges, media, and general community pressure. Bring them back for a case for due process. And it did ultimately happen. So this is your point. They're like towing the line right to the edge. However, there was a moment there where they're like, no, we can't even do that. It's not possible. Like that sort of machination is concerning, and in my opinion, is evidence of testing what this administration thinks they can get away with. And the point is, we can't let them get away with that, because that's my concern. Isn't that they are getting away with it yet, although I don't agree with what's being done at all. or the methods or anything. I don't agree with any of this, but we can't, as a society and as a legal system, allow them to get away with what's happening now or pushing over the line of legality, because it is my opinion that if they are allowed to go over the line, they will continue. And that's what I'm concerned.
And additionally, you don't think that other gun rights activists are as concerned as they should be at this point?
I don't see it. No, not often. I see people um, uh, applauding any of the quote unquote wins in terms to gun rights. One of the examples of this was during the big beautiful bill, um, where there was the proposal to remove suppressors from the NFA, which of course got gutted and turned into a $0 tax instead of a $200 tax, and now it's this interesting legal thing going on there. But there was a lot of cheering going on, and everybody's like, the big beautiful bill, this is it, this is our solution. But it was myopic in terms of one of the videos I had on my channel is one of the other proposals in the same big beautiful bill was to essentially sell off or potentially sell off swaths and swaths of public land. um and okay, I understand that's not a gun right, but if you're a firearms guy or you are a sportsman or a hunter or any of those things, if you get your suppressor back and there's no public land to use it on, have you won anything? That was one of the arguments I put on my video. I realized that's not as important as concerning as ATF questioning people on the streets of DC. I understand that. But to me, that's an example of that myopic nature that the firearms community in general seems to have towards these conversations.
Okay. Well, look, I appreciate you coming on and giving this point of view. I don't think it's something that gets heard a lot right now in the firearms community. So I wanted to have you on to go through and have this discussion, especially with these big developments in DC, and especially with the fact that I guess we maybe we'd just mention this quickly here at the end too, like not just DC. The president says he wants to do this in half a dozen other cities across the country. And you've seen the ranking member of the House Oversight Committee, James Comer, say that it would be a good idea to deploy the military to American streets to do crime deterrence, because he claims that's what the military has been doing in other countries, which is a bit of a weird, I think, categorization of what the U.S. military has been doing in other countries. But I don't know. I guess the thing is, you could see this happen in places beyond DC, even if people are less, feel less of a connection to DC residents.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So,
So
is
like you
that a
said,
concern you have too?
absolutely. So this is the test part I'm talking about, right? So DC is legally interesting in that this probably is a legal action for DC because DC is unique and different than like Los Angeles or New York or Boston. Um, however, it's funny because one of the things when you were saying that, one of the things I thought about that I is one of those catchphrases, one of those catchy, pithy things you hear in the firearms community often is, I would rather have dangerous freedom over authoritarian safety. You hear that kind of phrase. It's a catchphrase. It's been in the gun community for decades. I'd rather have dangerous freedom than authoritarian safety. And um, well, okay, then where are we? Even if there is a crime wave, which I don't believe that there is, but if there was, um, what are we picking, gun guys? Dangerous freedom or authoritarian safety? Because you can't have both.
And I would also say too that even if it'd be harder to deploy the military, it'd be easier to send federal agents to various cities. I mean, they're already in most cities, right? That's part of the system. But if these ATF tactics are something that becomes more common, that's when I would wonder if more gun rights advocates start to take your view of this.
I don't know. I do not want this to be the case, but I am fearful that it will be more common. I think we're at the beginnings of some larger things. One example of that, in my opinion, is while I know this is not ATF, but as we see it now, the budget of ICE is larger than that of the military of many nations. So something's being planned. Whether or not it's legal or not, I'm not even saying it isn't, but that is an interesting thing to keep an eye on. And if the ATF is being brought into the fold of a multi-agency effort, which we see them doing already because they're trying to bolster their numbers with some of these actions. And we see the AATF in DC. I don't know why we would not expect them to do that somewhere else too.
All right. Well, look, I appreciate you doing this. Appreciate you coming on and giving your thoughts and explaining your point of view on all this. And if people want to hear more from you or follow the other work that you do, where can they do that?
Well, first of all, Stephen, thank you for having me on. I know I do bring a different perspective sometimes into the space, and that can be contentious. So I just want people to realize I speak for myself and just myself. And that's hopefully why you're willing to have such an alternative conversation. And I appreciate you being willing to host that in your space. So thank you for that. In
Of
terms
course.
of me,
I mean, we want to get views from all over the place and try to have a good understanding of everyone.
that's what true media is supposed to be, right? That's what it's supposed to be. That's the whole point of that's the real job, in my opinion. So thank you for doing that, is what I'm saying, and I appreciate it. To find me, the easiest way is to go to my website, InRange.tv, and there's a link on there /watch. And obviously YouTube is the big gorilla in the room. That's what the predominant amount of views are and where the videos go. But I do decentralize my distribution of my content beyond just YouTube because I don't trust that platform. So you can find me in other places as well, BitChute, and I'm also duplicated on Recoil TV. And I post on social media if you just want kind of like my opinions. They're not always in the video. Sometimes I just discuss things. And you'll typically find me doing that on Facebook or even more openly so on Blue Sky.
Okay, great. Hey, appreciate you coming on. That's all we've got for this week. We will talk to you guys again real soon.